What's up, you guys? It's Benson.
And Mikey.
All right, and we're here to talk about cross-dressing today, especially in the medieval era, early modern Europe. Do you know anything about that, Mikey?
I can't say that I do, Benson.
Well, luckily for you, I am here to educate. I have researched a lot of different examples of people cross-dressing in medieval Europe, and there's a lot of primary sources that we're going to be talking about today, so I wanted to contextualize and shed light onto these individuals. There were clothing and beauty standards just like there are today. Men and women were seen as being very different beings. Women were typically seen as inferior to men. The hierarchies at the time benefited men and diminished women. Cross-dressing was seen as typically morally wrong, but in certain spaces it was accepted. One of those spaces being theater. In theater, we suspend our disbelief. The audience knows that the actor is playing a part. They comment on gender roles and play into these ideas of what men and women are supposed to be. In theater, cross-dressing may just be a costume, but maybe it's kind of more of an identity. So let's look at some examples. We got to talk about theater in medieval Europe because before 1660, which is Shakespeare plays, you know about Shakespeare, women were not allowed to be in any plays, any roles at all, and men were playing all of the parts, even female parts. So that's like one of our first examples of cross-dressing. I analyzed a source that talked about 3 different plays that were Shakespeare plays that men played these female parts, but it gets a little convoluted. I don't know if you're aware of The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. It came out in 1590, and it comments on the market relations and gender relations of what happened when people treat each other as goods to buy and sell and exchange. The women in the play use cross-dressing and these commodities to exchange and gain power that their societies have established for them, but they also engage in behaviors that are set apart from normative women in societies. Through cross-dressing, women are able to gain and maintain power over the men in their society, and if they succeed in manipulating this gender hierarchy. But at the time, it would have been men dressing up as women, dressing up as men. Right? Which is, it gets, so it's like, so the audience is aware that these men are dressing up as women, but the women in the play are dressing up as men. So are they, dressing as themselves? How do they play that role? In the play, Portia and Jessica are the cross-dressers, and they make specific choices that enable them to fulfill their desires and offer different degrees of speaking to themselves and to being more powerful. There are 2 key ways in which these women speak of themselves. They gain a sense of understanding of who they are in their societies, and they're aware of their power in their performances. A woman's sense of self dictates how she will perceive herself and how she will act. In Portia's case, this is merely her first layer. Her second layer is her cross-dressed self. So this is all from the article that I examined that talks about these plays and theaters. And even we have seen in theater women and men dressing up as other people, as other genders, and it's a space where it's accepted. So then in 1660, 100 years after Shakespeare and his plays, now women are allowed to be in these roles. Women usually playing young boys or young men playing women. So that changes these plays and how they were written and who Shakespeare intended the actors to be portraying. It changes the play entirely, and even now we see plays, modern day plays, being gender bent. Like you even saw
I was gonna say recently with Men on Boats, it was a whole woman cast, and it was literally about like
all supposed to be about men on boats. So it's changing that hierarchy, changing that dynamic has always been something that has been happening even in early modern Europe. And then another article, because I wanted to keep male to female dressing and female to male dressing in mind, this David Cressy article talks about gender trouble and cross-dressing in early modern Europe and kind of focuses on boys dressing for female roles because it seems like in a lot of articles it's not as written about, whereas female dressing as men is. I don't know. But he talks about these boys dressing as female roles was not an act of, usual convention in this Renaissance and dramatic period. He says that instead it was rather scandalous, a source of homoerotic attraction arousing deep-seated fears of an unstable and monstrous feminized self. That Female transvestitism on the streets of London and on the stage had been attacked by Protestant reformers and assumed to be a practice that was not accepted. And just as there are today, there's always going to be people that are against cross-dressing, even though it is happening in different spheres. A lot of the time we do see cross-dressing in like prostitution and like sexual fantasies of a man being a woman or a woman being man. So that's why I think it has such a negative attributes to it. He goes on to say that contemporary moralists knew exactly what was wrong at these unnatural and outlandish violations of costume. If it was unsettling in an age of ambitious self-fashioning that people use clothes to misrepresent their social status, it was downright disturbing if they misrepresented their genders by dress. So it's just saying that it's kind of unnatural, a violation of God. Because if you dressed as a man at the time, it was kind of just accepted that that's what you were. You were being a man. If that, outside of theater, the way that you dress has a lot of importance, and there's a proper way to dress. If you're a man, you dress as a man, and if you're a woman, you dress as a woman. And if you change that, people might not know if you're passing very well, which I think is very frustrating for people because, was it not written in Deuteronomy that transvestism was an abomination unto the Lord? Just saying that, like, men become effeminate and degenerate when cross-dressing and lose social power, whereas women kind of undercut that established order by gaining power within these plays. So definitely controversial, but definitely interesting and allowing for this to happen in a more accepted way. So another person I want to talk about who is really interesting is called Charlotte Charke, Charke, Shark, like the Charlotte Shark, like an amazing name already. So she was an English woman whose family was distinctly involved within theater within the 1700s. So this is now way past Shakespeare. Theater is going on and women are involved in that process. So Charlotte grew up playing male roles because her family was in a big theater family. So she even played Hamlet once. So she was a kind of a big deal. In her autobiography that she wrote about her life, explains that she was always treated more like a son and began cross-dressing at a young age, at 4 years old, wearing her father's wig that went down to her knees. Later in her life, she commonly dresses as a man named Charles Brown. She was a mother and was married twice, but everybody in her community knew that Charlotte was Charles, and they kind of just was okay with it. What else are they supposed to do? They all said that she was very eccentric. She was disowned by her family, which is relatable to many queer and cross-dressing individuals. She claims that she sent, this is actually really interesting. It was like a rumor and kind of allegations, I would say. Said that she sent a letter to her father just explaining her situation, and she said it was returned unopened. There was a rumor that went around that she had dressed as her alter ego Charles Brown and tried to rob her father, being like, did a bad job at being a dad, but he didn't recognize her. But Charlotte allegedly tried to tear down these rumors, so maybe it didn't happen, but it would be kind of fun if she did. She put all of her money into a puppet show that ultimately failed, and that was the life of Charlotte Charke. But I think, like, what is really interesting is that her history with theater. What we've already kind of established with theater is that gender and our expression in it is suspended. So if maybe growing up, being allowed to dress as a man freely and act as a man, let her gender expression be super fluid, because she goes back and forth. There's times where she's seen as being Charles Brown with her children, and they're like, where's your wife, and she was a mother and a spouse to people, so she was able to dress in a masculine way, but also still be a feminine individual. And I think that theater had a big role to play in her ability to express herself in that way.
It definitely gave her like an in, just
and where it's accepted and not like taboo. It's like, well, people want to see me as a man and think that I'm doing well.
And it's like, if you're doing good at something, why make them stop just because of
and
some
you like it and it's
stereotype?
fun, and so we don't know if it's necessarily what we would consider today as being trans, but definitely a fluid ability of being gender expressive. So then another person I want to talk about, now kind of shifting off of the theater vibes, is Joan of Arc. You know of Joan of Arc.
I do know Joan of Arc.
Well, Joan of Arc was a crossdresser.
I did not know that.
All right, let's talk about it. Joan of Arc was born in France in the 1400s. She had been hearing and seeing saints since she was 13. They told her that it was her destiny to stop the 100-Year War that was currently happening and lead the French to defeat England. Because of her actions, she was later canonized as a saint in Catholicism, which we are very well versed in. Joan transcended gender roles of the time by wearing male clothing, which was forbidden for women to do. Things like armor, nightwear, because she was fighting a war. What else was she supposed to wear? Yeah, she was a soldier. She claimed that God told her to wear male clothing to help defeat the English, and she was later captured by England and accused of heresy, which included blasphemy by wearing men's clothing, which was against God's wishes, even though that God had told her to do this. The English said that she was acting upon visions that were demonic. She was ultimately burned to death at the age of 19. And Shakespeare had even written a play about her life and Joan of Arc, which is interesting because a man would have been playing Joan in that theater, because Shakespeare that at the time. So this cross-dressing world is accepted, but also not accepted. And over time it becomes more... Well, they didn't really care that she was cross-dressing, I feel. I think it was more that she had led a war.
Yeah.
And they needed to be able to blame her for it. And cross-dressing was a way that they could call her out as being morally...
It was the best way to undermine her.
Wrong, yes.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate because she did some really amazing things for her country at such a young age as a woman. So now when we see pictures of Joan, we see her in armor, but still looking like a young woman and still being very feminized. She's an interesting kind of figure in this, and with it being so early in the 1400s of this happening and during a war, her fate was tragic. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was female husbands. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's kind of a lot of people talk about it with like medieval era, 1700s. It would have been women dressing as men to be able to get married to another woman. Because at the time, marriage was not for love, it was for financial stability.
Oh, yeah.
So we even see this with Charlotte Shark wanting to marry a woman and the woman not knowing she was a man. And they were like, we could get married and it would be great. And Charlotte has to be like, actually, I'm a woman and we can't, but it would be because we would get stability and we would get financial gain because Charlotte was super poor as her life went on, but was not able to. So some people we do see with that happening. Charles Hamilton was an example of this in the 1700s. Charles, at the age of 14, without a reason, stated that Hamilton put on clothes belonging to their brother and presented themselves as male. Hamilton secured apprenticeships with 2 different doctors over the years, gaining knowledge and confidence in both their gender expression and their trade. Then set off on their own, traveling to the south, west England, and offering pills, ointments, and advice to anyone who would have them along the way. So this is a person now gets more into transness, I feel like, and more people living as the opposite gender that they were born as and kind of hiding their identity, which is why these stories are told, because it's almost taboo of like, oh my god, this person is lying and
they see it as deceit.
People. Yeah, deceit. And so this person became a doctor, and Hamilton rented a room in the house of Mary Creed. So it was common for people to stay at people's houses if you were a doctor, if you were, a master of the household. Just staying with people was more common, where Creed's niece, Mary Price, also resided. The two became involved and were wed, traveling the country as husband and wife while Hamilton worked selling treatments for common ailments. Just shy of 2 months of marriage, Mary Price resolved that she was done with Charles. She reported her husband to authorities and claimed that she had just figured out that Hamilton was not actually a man, triggering an investigation into the person who would become famously known as the female husband. They were supposedly sexually intimate, but Mary was still unaware of the fact, so we don't know if they were using hands, dildos. It looks like penetration was involved, but I mean, the education of sex would not have been known. Yeah. No, you wouldn't have not known what a penis looked like unless you had a family member, and he was a doctor. Why would he not?
He obviously has to know about it.
Yeah, so that being dressing as this male authority figure as a doctor gave him the credence to be believed. Why would this doctor lie? Hamilton was prosecuted for vagrancy and sentenced in 1746 to a public whipping in 4 towns and to 6 months imprisonment with hard labor. And there's like kind of images online of like that happening. So we see like the whipping happening with like the bare breast exposed, which would have been outing this person. So horrible. With these stories, like why I think it's so important to talk about them is to know that they existed and that cross-dressing is a crime for some people. Like drag queens prosecuted for dressing as a different gender or as something that is sexually immoral. The punishment is to say that you cannot dress as something that you're not. So horrible. And another thing that I think is important to talk about is pronoun usage, because some of them were more fluid, some of them use both pronouns in their autobiography. So I think with different examples, Charlotte Charke was alright with her feminine identity, and so using she, her pronouns I think is acceptable just because she wrote her book under her name, Charlotte Charke. Whereas Charles Hamilton is seen as a man. I kind of just said they, them just to keep it, I'm not sure. But I would say that he, him is approved and acceptable. One last person I want to talk about and give another example about is Catalina de Erauso, who was born in 1592 in Spain. So this is after Joan of Arc, but before for women to be involved. So cross-dressing is happening because that's just the state of the world, and women are not even able to be in theater and do anything else other than be women, care for their household and care for the men. So De Erauso has a book about their life that shares stories about their experiences. They were raised in a very religious home and was taken to like a convent kind of when they were 4 years old, and as a young adult, Erauso escaped the convent and began wearing male clothing and changed their name to Antonio. De Erauso had always shown an interest in conquistadors and knights, because we're in Spain, and began to live their life as an adventurer. So they left the convent and said, fuck the religion, I want to be a man and I want to have adventures. So
for real.
So there are many juicy events that happen throughout the book, such as De Erauso accidentally killing their brother, having intimate relations with women who might not know, has the autonomy of a woman, and had a grand reveal of them confessing their true identity to the Pope. So what happened is De Erauso would go town to town, living as a man, starting, carrying weapons, having armor, and traveling is a big tool that a lot of these people use to cross-dress, because the less people that know you makes it much more accessible to live as what you want to be. So with Charlotte Charke traveling for her puppet show and De Erauso traveling between town to town and having these adventures, it allows them to have this cross-dressing identity. So De Erauso gets permission from the Pope to continue living and dressing as a man, because De Erauso doesn't respect religious authority at all. There's this one example where they're forced to have a host, what would be Jesus' body, put it in their mouth and then spit it out. And they're like, I hate Jesus. I hate all of this. You guys are so horrible. So then they're like, this person is demonic. How could they do this to the body of Christ? But we see when faced with the Pope, they confess. Just tell the whole story of what their life has been. This is in 1590s. The Pope allowing them to live as their male identity is really interesting, because what we've seen with a lot of these stories is it doesn't go very well. And they're not allowed to continue cross-dressing once they're caught, unless they're in a sphere such as theater or prostitution, where it's secretive. They're not living in everyday life as a cross-dresser. There was a play written in 1626 about De Erauso's life. They became kind of a celebrity. De Erauso has all these interesting stories of love and murder and deceit. Their stories were taboo. It's almost like you don't want to learn about it, but you do, because it's so interesting. It's like kind of our fascination with true crime. De Erauso has some strong opinions on religious figures, which makes them controversial figures. There was that fear of being exposed, and De Erauso becomes less religious over time and more violent with their gender identity. So there's a lot to talk about of, does that identity allow for them to commit these violent acts that he had not been using previously in a religious convent? Because being a conquistador, being a knight, being somebody that goes and gets into fights, and that's we see getting to a bar and then somebody saying something to them and then them just being stabbing them
Killed.
with a sword, and then then they get in trouble, and that's how ultimately ended up getting taken to the Pope. Definitely not something that we would defend, but something that they were now able to do with their newfound identity. So those are all the main stories and people that I wanted to shed some light on, and so now I just thought that we could kind of add a modern context to cross-dressing and gender expression. What have you thought about all of these things? There's a lot, because there's different people, different time periods, periods in different countries. So the punishment was less severe in Spain than it was in Europe. Spain is in Europe. But England or France. Why were they let it slide? Well, they had just been living as this way, so they were recognized as being a man.
It's just like crazy because they see it as such a line of deceit. They're like, I can't believe that you were this way and we thought you were this way. But it's like, you didn't even know.
It's only because you found out that you feel so betrayed by their actions. And obviously with the Charles Hamilton example, like really sucked to get married to somebody
you didn't know
was a woman. And now you're in a queer relationship, which is like, whoa, that can't happen in the 1600s. That's crazy.
It's an interesting thing, especially in like modern days. If someone is very passing and you're getting into a relationship, that is a conversation you have to have eventually, usually sooner than later. But that is
at
kind
that
of
time,
crazy.
I really like this person, but I can't tell them because they would never accept me for being this way. We can kind of understand why they would have done that.
Yeah.
Another thing is there's difference between the Protestant and Catholic religions at the time because there was a Protestant Reformation. So we see in some articles with the Protestants being a little bit less accepting of gender expression, but we also see with Christians being the same way of that God does not accept of this, and that's that. If God says that a man cannot be with another man or a woman cannot dress as a man, that, you know, being a transvestite is a crime. Everybody at this time is religious, basically. So that's a huge reasoning to deter people from cross-dressing. But we see that it's accepted in creative spaces. You're just dressing as a man for a play. It's all right because it's art.
As in, like, humor. You see, oh, it's a man dressed as a woman trying to seduce
funny.
them, and it's so funny. Because it's funny or it's used as entertainment, it's okay. But even then, it's, like, interesting how in theater it's so respected, but in drag shows are for entertainment, but people are still like, I can't believe you would do that. And it's like, it's for entertainment.
It's funny, you know?
It's like, you should respect it either way, but to think that they're so against, some people are so against drag, but it's fine in, like, theater spaces and things like that. It's all just performance.
I think talking about theater is so important because as somebody who's been involved in theater, it is a huge history of cross-dressing and queerness that is allowed to be expressed in that and gave a resource for people who wanted to be expressing themselves in this way and couldn't do it in the real world, an ability to kind of shift who they are and how they're presented as. I think that that's a really awesome thing that we should remember about theater. It does give people the ability to be something that they're not and maybe not comfortable expressing themselves in the real world as what they would like to be. As you talked about, thing that we've slightly touched on is the sexual desire that comes with the taboo nature of being something you're not, but still that being desired and people wanting to learn about it and read about it, being like the Joan of Arc plays, the De Erauso plays. These people are interesting. We want to learn about them, and even today we want to learn about them and why they did the things that they did and what that meant for them at the time and their consequences of their action. Whether that being accepted in these media or being joked about, sexual desire, it becomes taboo, where people like it but don't want to say that they like it. It still is accessible to the public. But it's okay when it's a play about Joan of Arc and a guy is dressing as a woman in the play that Shakespeare wrote. And then, when she was fucking killed for that action, 200 years later, a play is being written by Shakespeare where a man is playing Joan. And that's okay. And probably with the De Erauso, that was in 1626, which is before women were allowed. That would have been a man playing De Erauso as a man. We even get into topics about that with cross-dressing in movies today. Does an actor have to be trans to play a trans role? That definitely gets discussed. I wonder if De Erauso would be like, you're having a man play me? That's actually kind of cool, because I felt like I was a man, but to be more accurate, would it be a man playing a woman? I wonder if that would have offended De Erauso. Yeah, and then definitely differences of male to female dressing versus female to male. A lot of the stories that I focused on of specific individuals was female dressing as male. There is examples of male dressing as female. It's much more difficult to find stories of them living in everyday life. We see it's more like humor, I think, of just in theater where it's like a man being a woman. That's silly because he's a man. He has too much power. Why would he diminish himself in that way? Because another reason why maybe some of these women would have been doing this is also to gain more social power.
Yeah, the chance to even just be respected.
Charles Hamilton could never be a doctor. Maybe, you know, it was a profession that they wanted to be in, and that was a way for them to gain that. There's always other reasons, not just expression, these examples, because gendered hierarchy at the time was so rigid. You could not get out of that. So the only way to gain these occupations, to become a knight, to become a warrior, was to dress like a man. It's so interesting that even today we see similar stories. The letter that returned unopened by Charlotte Charke, of families disowning people for their gender expression. You can't be trans, you can't do this, blah blah blah, like we will not support you if you go on to do that, which was happening to these people hundreds of years ago. Like, I just think it's so fascinating to know that history has similar stories, and the people at that time are similar to the people today. It makes me change how I view my own experiences of gender, and that people had always been wanting to do things that maybe they shouldn't have been doing, that weren't accepted at the time, but still doing that, knowing the risks, still knowing that's something that feels true to who they were and who they are, and they still decide to cross-dress, and we decide to cross-dress. Michael?
Yeah. What up, Benson?
Yeah, super interesting, super fascinating. Yeah. And I have so much respect for all these people. Their stories deserve to be told.
Yeah.
Man, out.
Respect, pronouns.